So we're back to the exercise. We have had our initial meeting. We're starting to document the issue. It's been going on for a couple weeks.
We're still stuck with 760 because we've double checked everything. We've considered, everything reasonable and justifiable that we can pay for. And we cannot get beyond that. And, we kind of are not clear. We're not getting enough information, or the information they're giving us for that 2.8 million, we can't justify. So now this is where we're introducing this idea of some potential fees or costs that could hit us if we continue to fight this thing. If we go down the road of putting together, so all that time and effort that Marvin's talking about, that's included in this 1.3 million. It's going to take an extra manpower of I don't know how many days to sort through all the pieces, back up everything that we have in our estimates, double check them, have more meetings, trying to get more out of the contractor, getting all of the leadership involved. So, when you have a meeting with a bunch of high-powered people, that's a really expensive meeting. So you're considering all these costs to get ready to go and fight this thing till the end. So this is the amount we've come up with, this 1.3 million. So now we're saying, okay, our scenario, if we had to fight this thing, is going to be this 2.06. So 2 million, roughly. We're getting closer, but we're still 800,000 away. Will this be what we're calling pre-negotiation objective? This is how we begin this kind of assessment. So is this going to be the number we're going to go for? I mean, that 1.3 is a bunch of costs that we may or may not experience, right? But it is a potential out there. So how do we find what we want to aim for? Consider that maybe we're not aiming for a number, but maybe this range between 760 and 2 million. I mean, that's a pretty large range. It's huge. Trying to figure out where this 1.3 makes sense to us or not is where now we're discussing this with leadership, right? We're showing them how much the cost of fighting will be. And we're also looking at, what are the unknowns and how much. So going back to that chart where the risk, in that lower left-hand corner was green, everything was very plausible. That's that 760, right? We can settle that if the contractor will take 760 today. But now we start going into this 2 million range, and we're kind of creeping up into some risk factors that we cannot be absolutely sure about.
So again, I know that with Oahu District, Art was where we're not going to add in those costs. And that would be a decision that he would make because he's involved with preparing this information with the engineer. But we wanted to walk you through the thought process. That's part of the part B. Because like Marvin's saying, there are costs associated with that. I know, and maybe not every field office has experienced that, but when they have these claims, I know Kirshner has been involved with figuring out the time impact analysis on some of these bigger ones. And so that's where I would envision potentially using your open-ended to get support when you start to see this kind of bigger claim occur. And then, Art talks about the Kapolei Board of Water Supply change that occurred that ended up lasting probably a couple years. And much of the end of it was documenting what had occurred with the time. And so if you can do this contemporaneously as you're going through the change, it's much better. But you got to raise your hand and make sure you have this documentation at the very beginning.
Looking ahead, this is a justification that you can almost see in your mind, so why not write it down? Here's the contractor's proposal. That's where we started. And this is our ICE, our very solid, hard number for the change order number, right? And then we would also begin to explain any other adjustments that we made. So I didn't write it down here, but this is what we would have done in the exercise portion. How about adding in the 510, right? And what did that mean? What was in that time impact analysis? how much was our time, how much was their time. We would break that stuff down in our analysis, so why not write it down here? And then whatever additional information we gain from the contractor, so that July meeting that I just threw down there, where we try to state whatever we know at this point, right? And as you look at it, you know, you start to see where the holes are. And then you start to look at those other numbers. And this is where I mentioned that maybe you start looking at a range. But knowing that you're going to have to write it down and explain it kind of helps inform you on your decision-making process. You start to look at this justification and wonder, does it even make sense? Is it reasonable? So that's why you start doing this, just to kind of get a feel for where you're at. But you're starting to think it through. What's it going to look like? When I settle this thing, what's it going to look like? And so you're starting to paint that picture by starting that justification. And you're not done, so you're going to edit this thing to whatever actually happens, right? Nobody's seeing this but you. But this is your working document. A question that I have is, do you think you could settle at this point with the information that you have?
You know, contractor proposed 2.8. You hardcore, you feel like it's 760 at most. Then you're adding, okay, so the time it takes me to, I got to hire a claims person, you know, Kirshner's going to have to do my time impact analysis. There might be, that's the consultant fee part, and the litigation fee where, okay, so now we're going to have to get AGs involved. And these are the estimated costs associated with that. Again, that's what we'll talk about in part B. Okay, maybe I got another 1.3. So you're at 2 million with all the costs that you think might happen, which goes into that risk analysis that we talked about previously. But they're still at 2.8. So again, when you start elevating this number, it might go up. But this is through the exercise and thinking about all this cost, this is the most that you can justify. Are you ready to settle? What would be your proposal? And that's the kind of stuff we'll go through in the exercise. And so that's where, as we elevate, right? In our horror story example, I didn't feel comfortable settling because there was so much staff resistance to settling. But it was kind of like, if we have an alignment throughout the organization, then it's being directed. And so I know that some people are like, you know what, I need to be directed to do this. And that's fine too, but that's why let's do it as quickly as possible. And Charles, I just want to say, too much of a discrepancy, absolutely. And you're working with your supervisor to understand what you, they, and maybe the district engineer, I don't know what your titles are in your organization, are comfortable. That's why I'm saying on Oahu, Art was not comfortable with this discussion. And I just mentioned that we're going to go through the exercise, and it becomes incumbent upon you and your supervisor to say whether or not you'll consider this. But there are opportunity costs that are being lost with other projects that can be delivered. And I know within highway division, that's a big deal. And there are loss of funds that is happening, that if you don't get this project done, you're losing millions of dollars. Those things start to go into your risk analysis. So what is justified? What is reasonable? How are you going to settle? Sticking to your numbers may not always work. The contract is set up to go quickly through this process with 15 days and 30 days and a formal claim. I think I calculated, even under a formal claim, there's 60 versus 90 days for the engineer to render a decision. And then they go to the director as an alternative dispute. We'll talk about that, but it's really meant to go quickly through this process. I think sometimes we don't, and that's one of the messages here, like get through the process, look at the numbers, look at a range. You may not be comfortable in presenting that to leadership, but at least you've gone through the exercise and you have in your change order backup what those numbers might look like. And I was pinging Kaha'a a little bit because what came up the other day with Oahu District was, have you talked to Federal Highway? Because Federal Highway provides some of this money. And that's an excellent point, that we should have that discussion with Kaha'a and their construction expertise and get a better feel for what they might support. But that'll happen during the dispute, and what that number looks like and what they're willing to just support through this process. So now we've had that meeting, we're coming up with our numbers, we're going to have a project meeting. So we had an initial meeting, we understood, you know what, we're far apart. We got to start letting people know this isn't happening. It doesn't look like it's going to quickly go away. We're letting people know, we're going to start informing them. Remember, it's an email that goes to everybody now, so that everybody's informed of where you are, and you need to start compiling that documentation. The next step is going to be a project meeting with you and the contractor. And this is really going to start that documentation that we talked about. You had your position. Now we need to get their position. If solely based on discrepancy, what would be a comfortable spread? I'm assuming that there are other points to consider and not just the discrepancy. So we don't, these are made up numbers. We would love to use an actual occurrence. Our horror story, we personally weren't involved with the rest of the discussion, but you can see it went from 1.5 to 9 million. Even if we take off some zeros, your numbers might be going from 150,000 to 900,000. Is that comfortable? It really depends on the situation. We can't dictate what that is. Overall, we've talked about 10%. Like if you're within 10%, then that's good. But it goes back to that 1.3 million of consultant and litigation costs. As Marvin pointed out, we're super busy. We can't always do this. So those consultant costs might be very real numbers. When you start talking about litigation, I know one of the issues that we looked at trying to use as an exercise for this class went to mediation. One of the reasons it was settled was litigation costs. And the litigation costs were 400,000. So that's why that was settled, was based on litigation costs. Unfortunately, I think it's really, it's hard for us to say without a scenario to, this is the actual cost. We'll work through those discussions in part B, and we'll show you some of the scenarios in our horror story example that are being justified. But again, without working on an actual issue, it's so hard to say. There are so many factors that can go into it. And it depends on your leadership. It depends on federal highway.
You would have a breakdown, to have come up with that 1.3 million. You would have some potential costs that you've somehow estimated. You've based yourself, it's going to take 2 months to do this, and who's going to do it. So you multiply rates out and you come up with numbers, right? And they added up to the 1.3. So there would be a way to take a look at that 1.3 and maybe pick through the costs that you feel like that's going to be a cost we're going to experience. And this one out here, that's only if, I don't know, something happens, right? So you could pick that 1.3 apart if you wanted to get more comfortable. But what we're saying is that amount is like everything we think it's going to take to fight this thing in court. So that's just a broad
becomes
description.
Your maximum. So you might say, okay, between this point and this point, it's only this. If we get to this point and we do X, Y, Z, say you have this meeting, there's another meeting after this in the dispute resolution process. You have this meeting, you have the next meeting. You can't solve it. Now you're in the litigation cost and you're starting to add in an AG's office, things like that. So there may be a tiered approach to your 1.3, but you've looked at those costs and estimated those costs. I kind of say every person in a meeting is about $200. So you could range, again, we're looking at all of your package and compensation. So there are costs associated with staff doing stuff. Just like Marvin pointed out, we got all this stuff to do. If you're not doing it, a consultant's doing it. So that's $200 for them to do it. In this meeting, I like to look at the meeting. How many people do we have sitting on the line right now? This is 24 people sitting here right now. So it's $4,800 an hour cost for this training on how much time it takes us to deal with disputes. So if you look at this, you look at the documentation you have to provide, you can break down those costs. Then if you go beyond a certain point, you start adding litigation costs, maybe specialist costs. Again, if you need somebody to do a schedule analysis, The 1.3 is a number. What risks have we quantified that we feel are actual risks in the short term? When you start going long term, maybe 6 months, I'll tell you, at the organization we were talking about, every day that all these people were on the job, for the owner, as we calculated, okay, we think this person spends an hour every week on our project. We went through the exercise. It was $50,000 a day to run the project. So for 30 days extension, there's a cost to us. There was consultant cost and staff costs, and then the litigation costs on top of that. So there's a way to break it down. Even if you look at the district may have this, you may have admin staff, all of those go into an indirect cost that sometimes organizations have. Somewhere you've got it because you have budgets and you have to do budgets. So those are the costs that we're looking at. I think the point is not to shy away from having discussions with higher ups to quantify unknown risks. And many times a change order dispute is avoided because people are not comfortable or not familiar with how to solve disputes, and they rely on the AG's office to lay out the path forward. So that's exactly part of the point. Is there costs associated with time and disputes? If we go back to the section 2 of this, there's a risk analysis and there's documentation. All of this is costs. And it is, at least with Highway Division, the perspective of the current deputy is you go to the AG's office with some of these numbers. The AG may say, you know what, I think your litigation costs are high or whatever. And this is all internal analysis that you're doing at this point. You haven't talked to the contractor. But what we've seen is some people dig into the construction costs, that's $100,000, and they can't see past the time that it's taking to do all this. I think there was one comment, because we were talking about how to move a project forward, and the comment was, we don't think of state DOT time, like Marvin's saying. It takes time for you guys to do that. You guys aren't free. I mean, there's cost associated with you. And if you have a consultant doing, there's cost as well. So let's talk about those costs. Let's put them into a risk analysis. So now in our process, again, we've had a discussion, disputes not going away. We got to start documenting our position, which was step 4 point whatever it was, and the contractor's position. So this next meeting, both parties shall understand the other's position. This is crucial. I think Art has been very good, the construction engineer for Oahu, saying, what is their perspective? So that's what you're gathering at this meeting. What is their perspective? And confer with them. Hey, so I think you don't agree with us because of XYZ, because you're going to have a memorandum from record at this point. All the meeting attendees shall attempt to identify and resolve the individual issues. If you can get resolution, maybe it's miscommunications, you can move those forward, either not pursuing or starting change orders, whatever, and then document their position and your position of any outstanding disputes. And then there's a memorandum for record that becomes essential as documenting what's transpiring and preparing for the next meeting. We've gone through that exercise. We're back to our example.
So now you've even talked maybe with your AG's office and gotten some information. And the question comes up of whether that's the worst case scenario that you're presenting. So you go back to the drawing board and think about what is your worst case, and you came up with this number, this 5.7 million really. Where do you think that comes from? You guys have any idea how we would have arrived at that kind of a number? We were only at 2 million. How did we dream up 5.7? Any thoughts?
Holy crud. You had 2 million and now you're at 5. All they want is 2.8. So where are these numbers coming from?
So this is our maximum exposure or maximum risk. What would possibly cause this kind of maximum exposure, maximum risk? Legal fees,
attorney fees, etc., legal fees.
Okay, yeah, we talked about that in that 1.3, right? Anything else? Other liabilities if work is not done. Okay, yeah, maybe having to go get someone else to do it. But what else? What would be the absolute worst thing? It would almost be demoralizing, maybe. What do you think that would be?
So you have legal fees, maybe going along legal
Our
fees.
reputation.
What legal fees in particular? Actually, Miles has it. Contractor, attorney legal fees.
Well, they both, yeah, there's a couple of people saying legal fees, but Joy is a little closer when she says our reputation. So what would destroy our reputation? Business loss cost too. Okay, yeah, that's if someone got hurt on the job. Well, so how about this? Okay, and project never gets completed. Bonding is part of costs that might be included, yeah. But what would be the worst thing with this that, would hurt our reputation, would escalate the cost to this much? How about we take this all the way to court? We go all the way, all that 1.3, we spend that money, we do it, and we lose. So now what are we?
That's why I think Miles hit it, because he said contractor attorney fees. So if you lose,
right, you're paying for their fees too. And what else? Now think of all the possibilities. So you've already kind of hit some of it. The contractor's going to get what he wanted to begin with, plus all the costs of getting what he wanted. And we got to pay our own costs of trying to, of losing. We pay all of their costs and their desires and impacts of what was provable, and then all of our costs to try to fight that. So that's where that 5.7 million number can come from. Imagining and potentially, theoretically, coming up with those kind of numbers that would show that's our absolute worst case scenario. Are we ever going to get there? I mean, the whole point of this is to try to avoid it, right? But we want to spell that out to just show that, okay, we keep going down this road. This is that worst case. So does that give us a more urgent sense to settle, to figure something out? So now, is a 2.8, a better number now?
And honestly, this is the part that started to come up in the other meeting about whether federal highways would participate in these kind of numbers. So I don't know if Kaha'a is around. And then I think Justin made a point, paying contractor proposal, government costs. There is this thing, and it came up in another meeting, and I just happened to have been exposed to this law. There's a law that basically, if you put in an offer and the offer's refused, then you can claim under HRS blah, 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 all the costs that you have experienced at that point or after that point, if it's settled for less than the amount. I got to find that law, and maybe we'll talk about it in part 2. Well, so I guess the point is that there are laws. We'll talk about it a little more. I guess I don't want to represent that we're legal people, but we want to expand your mind in some of these. So like Alan said, if you lose, there are more costs. So when we started this exercise, we were talking about the construction costs. When we went to the construction costs, we started looking at staff time. Then we started looking at staff time, litigation, and consultant costs. Again, it could be consultants helping to solve the issue. It could be schedule analysis type people. This is a fictitious example. The maximum government exposure now starts to incorporate what if you lose, you spend all that money and you lose, and now you have their costs on top of your costs, on top of what you had originally paid.
But there are other ways, right, of getting to settlement, and they each have their own kind of costs. So that's what we'll talk about next. So this 5.7 number isn't the end all, right? There are steps in between.
So if Kaha'a chimes in at some point, and that's specific to Highways Division, I think one of the questions that came up is, would federal highways participate in this kind of stuff? And I think, again, I personally think it has to be project specific. We have to look at the circumstances, what were all the things that led to this, and was it documented, tons of considerations. But let's go through some other options that might be at the disposal of the government and or the contractor to help get to resolution. So again, we've got negotiation. That's kind of where we are now, where they attempt to reach. Okay, Kaha'a. So I think part of this is looking at numbers. We've got the contractor that's at 2.8. We start looking at what the maximum exposure to the government is. We're doing a risk analysis overall on all of these costs. We're putting it into this giant bucket. So the question that came up was, would Federal Highways participate in this?
So, and I would go with the answer that you actually provided, which is, we got to look at it on a project by project basis, right? What I will say is everything you said so far is entirely in line with what I've learned during my time with Federal Highways. In the projects we've dealt with in terms of delays, claims here in Hawaii, it's been limited, official claims. When I was on the mainland, we had a couple each year. But we do look at kind of holistically the things that you listed out here. Actually, here in Hawaii, during my time in Hawaii, I haven't seen anyone do as detailed a job as you've done here today to really show what are all the different types of costs that go into a delay. During my time in the mainland, we have looked into that. I mean, when our team sits down at the table to look at whether we're going to go to litigation or not, they break apart costs this way. They do cost takeoff, looking at the same risks and potential costs that you guys are. Staff's time, have we well documented? Where are we in terms of documentation support? Are we well documented? Do we have a position? Okay, what would that cost us if we were to litigate, right? Our lawyers' time, their lawyers' time, and then even if we always got to look at, even if we are doing well. I know I'm going a little far cry, but this has been my experience in the mainland. They also look at, even if we have a legitimate case, what are those costs? Because in some cases, even though we're legitimately in the right, and say in some cases we're well documented, it doesn't always go our way. So what's the risk that we end up paying their legal fees? And I saw, Alan, I think you talked about that a little bit and showed that cost. So I've seen that, estimated as what we may have to pay if we move in to the next phase. And we always look at it in phases, at least in my experience while I was in the meeting. Again, we haven't gotten that far here, but these are legitimate costs that need to be considered. And I do appreciate you and the team, the HDOT team, taking all these things into consideration. It isn't just what, the dollar amount the contractor asks for the first time when these things get too far. So, Kai, I don't know if I answered your question, but it is on a case-by-case basis. And we do look at all the things you're talking about. So I do appreciate you guys taking the part.
I think that's assuring, just because some of these concepts, like you say, are a little bit out of there, and again, it's so project specific on what's happening and what you feel the outcome might be and how you've documented that it's imperative. And I'll say on Leeward, which I see Keith on, I don't know if Alex is on, we're kind of in that situation where we've involved Federal Highways. Hey, this is where we're at. We're going to try to move forward because we want to get the project done. But there are these issues, disputes that keep arising that prevent that from progressing. So we constantly have to do that risk analysis on whether we keep going, do we demobilize, do we do X, Y, Z. And I think as partners, Federal Highways is there to support us as long as we're proactively managing these risks. And keeping them in the loop. And so I know again, you can't make a blanket statement that, yep, Federal Highways participate, because it's so dependent on what's going on in the project and the decisions that are being made by leadership, why those decisions are there, were there other alternatives that could have been pursued. So I appreciate that comment, and we'll move on after you say something, because it looks like you're going to say something.
Is just to kind of reinforce what you just said. A lot of times it's easier to support costs that are in the gray, where it could go either way, when the team, in this case the DOT team, has built a really strong case, right? It allows us to pull more things in the gray into the favor of DOT.
So going back to some other things, yeah, Alan?
I was just going to say, just the mere fact that the worst case scenario and even our projected litigation costs are estimated and not actual is a good place to be, right? because we have the ability to work with our leadership now and make these kind of decisions versus after the fact, just being faced with all these bills.
So again, proactively managing the projects. So here are some things, we've been dancing around the costs. These are ways that we can settle, again, not usually part of the contract, not usually part of a formal claims process, at least as laid out in DOT's contract, but other methods that have been employed that are at the disposal of AGs. I think that's why they kind of leave it gray, is to have the opportunity to kind of pick and choose what they wanted to do. My personal experience has been more with mediation. And I will say, and raise your hand if you've been part of mediation, but I feel like it's a let's make a deal. It's not so much about the facts. It's more, how can we leave today with an agreement? And so I think that's where, when we go way back to the slides that said, I am right, or even what Kaha'a said is like, this is the right thing to do, those things start going away a little more, and it becomes, what can we resolve and how can we leave with this dispute being solved? So this is where you kind of go. There's another method called expert determination. Again, I feel like you can use DOT contract office in that way. When they look at your paperwork, they can look at what the contractor's providing and provide an interpretation of risk at that point. I think you can do that with the AG's office when you have your case. So definitely use those resources. Through the working group, I think there was a discussion on, well, we couldn't get the lawyers involved. So now hopefully through the slide deck, you understand how to get the lawyers involved. I don't think there was a fear of doing that. It was just making sure you have all your documentation to get to that point. So there's possibility using expert determination. Adjudication is another option. And again, as we go through these options, the options start to get more and more. That adjudicator will provide a decision. There's arbitration. What I've been told is that you're getting to be just as much as it is to go to court. And unless it's written or agreed upon that it's binding arbitration, it's like going to this process, and in the end, you still might not have a decision. So at the very end, you would have litigation that involves a trial. And honestly, that's what is laid out in the DOT specification, as well as I believe in the state law, is if the director does not agree with the formal claim, the engineer says no, the director, they appeal to the director's appeal is no, the final remedy for the contractor is litigation through court. So we're going to go back to our example. As Alan said, maximum exposure, not only your costs, but now we look at their costs, all of everything, the kitchen sink, everything in there. Okay, so here we are. We're back to our example, and there's time.
So now we're taking a step back, kind of to look at where are we in this contract? Kind of a reality check of how much more are we going to be working with this if we're at such an adversarial place. So this is that comfort with going forward. Can we continue to work together if we go through this fight? We've got 14 months left at this point of, we know we're going to give them 17 months. We owe that. And time is ticking, and there's still a year and 2 months left of getting work done. So how does this make us feel with the comfort of the settlement that we're looking at potentially and continuing to work together? What else could go wrong? Is there potential for more? And if more goes wrong, are we going to be able to work together? Because we've had such a huge confrontation on all this. If our goal is to finish this contract and produce this work to the community, are we going to achieve that? Or is this going to be so broken? So there's other things to consider that are not necessarily or possibly cost impact. I mean, they could come back again and say, we don't like something about this or that maybe wasn't a consideration as we're going forward with this particular change. So there's a lot of time left, and there's a lot that could still happen. So it's something to also consider as we make this decision, as we're starting to form our decision.
Okay, so again, we're walking through this example. We've had a meeting, we understand the issue, now we've documented all that. Really, this is where we want to have a decision. Through the district level, you have the district engineer, construction engineer, resident engineer, project engineer. Everybody within the district hierarchy is involved, along with the contractor's counterpart. So again, as we talk about the pre-con, we might start laying out who are those counterparts, so we understand how we informally are going to elevate these issues. Again, there's always a formal process that's called for in the contract, but what we've seen within DOT highways is there's all this informal stuff that happens, and we wanted to kind of walk through a process and have it in your procedures to understand how you would elevate your disputes or issues. So the counterparts are going to be at this meeting. The engineer shall always be present. The engineer as delegated through the definitions that we discussed, because they're the ones that have been delegated the procurement responsibilities from the director under this particular contract. You have the district engineer. They should be consulted before a final determination is rendered. They'll consult with the engineer. Some of these issues, again, came from the working group because they felt like these discussions were happening. They weren't involved. They didn't understand it. So again, that whoever that authority is needs to be part of these discussions. They may not be talking during the discussions, but they should be present during the discussions. If resolution can be reached, then you resolve it. Everybody in the district is aware of it. Done. If it cannot be reached, again, we need that memorandum for record. And then the final recourse for the contractor would be that formal claim. So we want to quickly move through this process, this informal process. If we still can't agree at the district level, then it's probably time for the contractor to put in a formal claim. And so now we're going to go back to the exercise and look at all the numbers that we've come up with.
So now your whole leadership's involved, right? At this meeting that we just talked about. And this is the information they have to look for. They've been briefed on the breakdown of all these numbers, and they recognize where we are in the contract. So do you think might actually settle? Do you think there's possibilities now of people making reasonable decisions to settle this change?
Based on numbers you can support. I think one of the things that we heard was, well, they just gave in to the contractor or whatever. Well, at least now you have a range of options that you've presented to your leadership that they can talk about, that they can go with their counterparts to better understand. Again, there's some of this we're starting to get, above what they're requesting, but maybe they don't support that. So again, it becomes an internal discussion on what your recommendations are and what your supervisor going all the way to the district engineer. Anybody ready to settle? I think these are the things we'll talk about in the exercise. We'll have more discussion and dialogue on the calculations and where they're coming from. We also wanted to talk about some, and I think this came up as how do you come up with these reasonable numbers for the discrepancy? There's a spreadsheet, if you would say, Alan, on what the Corps of Engineers use when they look at risk versus profit and what that might look like based on their data. I like to bring up the HART procurement that's going on right now because there's a discussion on the P3, and a big part of the discussion is transferring risk to the contractor. So there are people out there that calculate these risks. So they're not necessarily made up numbers. So rather than letting the discussion or dispute get elevated and there's just kind of an arbitrary dialogue that comes up with the settlement, which is kind of what, not all the time, but there seem to be happening. There are ways to quantify that. And that's what we want to stretch your mind a little bit and be open to what that analysis looks like. Again, you don't have to use any of it, but if you looked at the numbers, you can always break down the risk into numbers. And I think sometimes a contractor will say, oh, we're pricing the risk, but we can kind of understand what that is. And let's work those numbers. Yeah.
And so a lot of times people have a hard time with just okay, what is risk and paying for risk. So just recognize that we pay for risk all the time. What is it called in our proposals, in our change orders? We pay for risk. We just call it profit.
Unrealized risk is profit, right? So the contractors are in business. They're not there to do a public service necessarily. They're there to make some kind of profit. And so if they have staff that's inexperienced, we talked about that as being an issue, that has to do work over and over again, you know, they're tracking those costs. They're tracking rework costs because they don't go into a project with the bare minimum. They have some kind of markup that accounts for those risks. If they execute the project well, the risk becomes profit. If they don't execute the project well, they're paying for the risk, and maybe they pay for more, which turns out to be a loss on their side, that again, they're going to have to make up somewhere in this, you know, cash flow calculation that we do. So there's a way to quantify that. And that's what we're asking through this exercise is how are we quantifying that? What does that look like on the government side?
So I'll just say, since nobody wants to venture whether they would settle, I'll just say that this is loosely based on a real scenario. I took away some zeros. What they actually did settle on was $2 million. That was agreed upon with the engineer of record, with, you know, say with leadership there involved in understanding, supporting it. So they settled at $2 million, and we're getting ready to start writing up their change order based on all the information they had. What do you guys think of that? Do you see that as a reasonable settlement, $2 million? So nobody's asked me about the pink block. What is that 35% of the maximum exposure? So that was just another way to evaluate that 2 million, 2.06. We got that one way by actually looking at hard costs and estimating our potential fees. And we recognize that if we went the worst case scenario, about 35% of that is pretty close to our number. If we did go up higher, of course, that exposure percentage goes higher. So maybe 35% of a maximum is a reasonable, palatable kind of number. It's not 10. It would have been nice if it was 10, because that's even more reasonable, right? But it's looking about the 30% kind of range.
So I think one of those, and I'm not sure if we mentioned it, but going back to the time remaining, there was part of this is a global kind of wrap up of other risks. And so looking at it, it was a discussion on, okay, we're full and final on everything to this point. Again, to your point, Justin, where they're reducing risk on other items, there might have been risks that were outstanding. They're saying, okay, so we're going to go ahead and settle for this amount, but we have these things lingering. So to this point, you have no merit on compensation for those issues. And so I think those are the things that you work into your settlements that can defer and justify. I think what Capole, we paid for so much time, but then we said, you know what? There have been so many design issues on this that we're going to grant a time extension for more, but we're not paying for any of that extended overhead. But at least if there's an issue on the government side, that we no longer own that issue because we'd allowed for time. So again, if you look at those issues where you are in the contract, she's saying we're at, what did we say, 70% complete, 50% cost growth. Okay, so now in the next 50%, we might have more cost growth. Is there a way to kind of globally settle all of these items? So we're starting fresh. Maybe it's a little higher than we initially wanted to justify at 760, but we've mitigated future risks by settling everything to date. So those are the things that you can work into it. And remember, in our part 2, we'll kind of play with these numbers. We'll talk about profit versus risk. An example from the core, it might be things that you can use on your own projects. Again, talk to your leadership about what you would want to justify and do. So based on the meeting we've had through the district at this point, some of those issues got settled and we were able to write up the justification. Again, we've been doing this documentation with memos for record that should be in your change order backup file. You may summarize it in your justification, but we've done that. So now in writing up the settlement, which we'll do in part 2, we're back to our example.
Now that we've had a settlement, we're going to talk about who was at that meeting, right? We're going to record all that information either in a backup document and refer to it like this. And then we're going to try to specify all the places where we know we agreed, right? Or where we disagreed. But that becomes the scope, that we make sure that whatever the scope of the change is, that what we want them to do is covered. And maybe our disagreements might be on certain prices, rates. Essentially, a lot of times when these bigger changes occur, we end up settling on the bottom line, right? We say, here's our bottom line number, we'll agree to that, even if we disagree on these other parts. So we're not agreeing to these other rates that we cannot justify on our own, but for the sake of settling and moving the project forward, there's a bottom line amount that we can agree to and get this thing moving. So it's important to just identify those agreed and disagreed items when we do these kind of settlements. Because we don't want to settle and then another change similar comes up with using one of those rates and they say, well, you agreed to it in that other change order. Why is this number no good? Well, you documented that it wasn't good, but you settled just to get moving because there might have been pluses and minuses between your estimate and the contractors. And this is hopefully all pre-priced and not after the fact. So it's that gray area. When you have gray areas, you can give. But on the next change order, we're not held to everything that was included in this change here. So that's why it's important to show those things.
Okay, so we've got we've got settlement on part, but there was part that was still not settled. And so again, after the district level, it's the formal claim. So we haven't really gone to the administrator. Again, if they go straight to the deputy, the process should be to refer it back to the district. So really that informal process lies within the district. And as the district and the engineer makes a decision that's final and conclusive, that should be it. The next step is going to be a formal claim. And so the agreement with management, and again, realize this is about a month old, so not everybody's used to it, but those discussions had happened. So make sure you're raising it. If they're not getting followed, then let's have a discussion with management to make sure they do get followed. So the engineer decision goes into a final claim. So now we're in the formal claims process. DOT Highways has a procedure, 10-0207, that talks about the formal claims process. We mentioned that the AG's office should be notified. I believe that's in the formal claims procedure. We're now in a formal claim. So the district engineer needs to brief the administrator as well as the deputy. And then before the engineer, again, whoever has been delegated that responsibility, makes their determination, make sure you have concurrence all the way to the deputy, because the recourse after this is the director. So again, we want to make sure before we had the alignment in the district, now we want to make sure we have alignment up to your deputy. Make sure in your documentation, you've talked about the range of alternatives of resolution that had been considered. I know in this one issue, we kind of were playing with the dispute resolution elevation, and the deputy actually said, hey, I want to do this. So let's go ahead and settle and do this. And it was one of the alternatives that were considered in the range of alternatives. So they were briefed on it. It didn't go to the AG's office, and we were told to settle and do XYZ, worked with the deputy. They worked with their counterpart. The issue was resolved before we got to the final claim. So settlement, if it's not possible, there are those dispute resolution alternatives that we talked about. Again, because it's not a contractual requirement, you really have the range of alternatives to explore. Again, you can talk to contracts office, AGs, all those things. Make sure you go through your appropriate process. And the contractor, if they accept the engineer's decision, you're done. You've gone through the formal claim. If they don't accept it, the next recourse, like I said before, is court. So let's go through what 107 says. We kind of talked about it. But the engineer should review and make a decision. And these are the timeframes associated with the decision depending on the value of that decision. If the engineer does not have a written decision within the time frame, the contractor may proceed if it was denied. So again, that we have these time frames. Even if you're not responding, the contractor should follow the time frames. Make sure you're responding to them appropriately. The decision will be sent to the contractor by certified mail, return receipt. Then the next step in accordance with your contract is appeal of the engineer's decision to the director. So that's why it's important getting alignment all the way to your deputy, making sure that happens. And then the appeal to the engineer must happen within 30 days of your decision or lack of your decision. So again, we have these time frames that everybody should be following to make sure issues are getting resolved. The record on the appeal by the contractor's director shall be limited to the claim as submitted by a contractor. Again, the claim under 107.15 that they have submitted to the engineer, so they shouldn't be adding other things. It should be the same issue. And then the director's discretion, they may ask for other information and in whatever they need to make that decision and the merit of the appeal. What I wanted to point out in HAR, which we referred to earlier, is this is also in HAR. It's got the 90 days time frame. So this is not only with DOT highways, it's part of the law, so it applies to DAGs, it should apply to harbors. Procurement officer shall immediately furnish a copy of the decision to the contractor. Again, same thing. In most cases, the procurement officer is the director, but again, check with your particular department. Let's go back to HAR again. Unless the contractor brings action seeking judicial review of the decision in circuit court within 6 months, the issue is done. So this is, again, this is the law. So this is reflected in your specifications, but it's also state law. We have an issue. It was denied. It was appealed to the director. Contractor may proceed. If the contractor disagrees, the next step is legal system, which is what we just talked about. We want to go back to our exercise a little bit, because what happened, we had the meeting, the engineer said, no, we're not agreeing to this. They appealed to the director. What did the director say? From the exercise scenario, the contractor calls the director, says, but wait, we have 14 months left to do this work. By settling lump sum, he's taking all the risks. He wants to add 25% to the risk. The director needs to get this project done. These are legitimate issues. They're dealing with ledge. They're dealing with public impact. You know, people are grumbling. So he offers half the amount. The contractor agrees. The director then informs everybody down the line, this is the settlement. Proceed, execute a change. It happens to be resolution that you do not agree with. What are you going to do? I see a bunch of chat. So contractors elevated it. So even though we have this process and we've appealed to the director, realize there are still things that are going to happen that you don't agree with. That's just life. That's the way it is. I think one of the REs had mentioned, well, you said that our decision is full and final, and that's true unless it's not, right? Contractor can always say, I disagree. The contractor always has an appeal process. What we're trying to advocate is follow this process, but there are going to be scenarios where the process isn't followed. We need to raise our hand and say, hey, it was important to staff to follow this process, remind management of such. But again, director is director. They still have opportunity to do what they think is fair and reasonable, and the settlement may occur. So let us know if you have comments. But what we wanted to end with is some of the write-ups that you might experience. So I think through the working group, there was a discussion on, well, we're paying for work that isn't justified, that this is illegal, that it's fraud. Just be careful with those kind of terms, because there are legal implications that go with that term. And a director is a procurement officer. And again, maybe they are the procurement officer, maybe they aren't, but you got to look at your scenario, who's been delegated those responsibilities. But they have the discretion and procurement responsibility and authority to execute these kind of settlements. So they might be paying for work that wasn't verified, but it's in place so we know what happened. It might be damages because of the poor traffic control and backup, so there are user costs associated with it. It might be material certifications that aren't actually meeting the requirements, costs that are repeated, enforced account, unauthorized work, all these things. In your settlement, there may be an opportunity to eliminate LDs, maybe eliminating lane rental fees. So there's a way for you to justify those items. Inform the contractor that DOT maintenance will complete the project, so there are other alternatives to getting the work done. All of these things can be quantified, but what would you put in your write-up? And I think this is important because as we talked about this through the various levels for the dispute resolution, managers consistently said, if I make a decision, I am willing to put my name behind it. So why not put that in your write-up? If you honestly disagree with it, you can say that, but in your write-up, you can say, manager determined that the cost, which could not be verified in the amount of XYZ is, and compared to those costs that I can justify, were acceptable to settle this change. The manager determined this course of action as a prudent business decision on such and such date during this phone call at this meeting, whatever it might have been. All of the managers within DOT highways said they would be comfortable with this kind of documentation if those are the decisions being made. I think the question that came up with, in particular with Federal Highways, is Federal Highways going to participate in it? We don't know. It depends. You know, if they're making a decision, Federal Highways should be briefed on those decisions, and then at that time they can decide whether they're going to participate or not. If they decide not to participate, maybe that changes your manager's decision. Maybe it doesn't. We're trying to give you the tools and the words that you might use if you were in these kind of situations. So again, on the right, we've got manager determined that the payment for work not in full compliance with the contract will be made without reduction to the value to settle this change. And write out those changes. They determined it was a prudent course of action. It was a business decision. So again, managers within DOT said, if we're going to make these decisions, we're good with our name being behind it. Right now, I know another thing that came up is, well, they don't sign the change order. So you may want them to sign a memo. You may just process it with this verbiage going to the district engineer. They're reading it. Again, it helps you not have to write things up that you don't believe in. You can accurately describe the decisions that are going on. Work with your supervisor to make sure you're annotating it correctly. Again, the main thing is, let's solve the dispute, get it finalized, document it, codify it, and move on with your project. So we don't let these issues linger. Anybody super uncomfortable with all of this discussion? Or like, whoa, we went from 200, I think it was 200 something, to 2 million in the course of 30 minutes. How in the world can that happen? Again, depends on the situation. These are all the things we talked about. We talked about disputes, what they are, situations you might be experiencing, why we need to solve it. There's a cost to these things. The engineer has been delegated those procurement authorities under the contract. So it is within your sphere of decision making to solve these at your level. Make sure you have that documented appropriately. So if you ever need it, it's there. We'll talk about what that record of negotiation looks like. And in your dispute resolution process, we have a step-by-step to get you through informal resolution before you get to the formals, claims, and beyond. So it walks you through the entire thing. And remember to elevate those issues that you're butting heads, you can't solve. You got to start making the documentation. If you don't have the resources to do it all, raise your hand again. No, that's the end of the content. And again, we have the actual optional exercise where we'll talk about profit and these tools that at least the Corps of Engineers uses. Your department, division may want to adopt those kind of tools, at least use it if you have to justify what is risk, what is profit. But those are the calculations we're going to go through and try to show you how we came up with these numbers and start writing up your justifications. Contact Jiro if you're going to sign up for these optional classes and exercise. We will record it, so it will be on the wiki site. You have that in your slide deck. So again, if you need anything, let us know, but that's it. Again, we appreciate your time.
What if our funds available cannot cover the settlement?
Yeah, and I think that's where you would write that into your settlement. You may not be able to provide the funds. That's actually an excellent point that we've been kind of informally talking to Kaha'a about the contingency amounts. And maybe there's a way, as you're looking at the beginning of the project, looking at additional funds. There's a lot that goes into that because you also have pipeline. And so if you have funds in your contract, but you don't have funds to cover this, you may have to do that accounting change to move funds over here. I think in Keith and Alex's example, we haven't even started construction. We know there's money in the contract, but we know there's additional funds that we're going to need to complete the contract. So it becomes, okay, do we ask for more money or do we borrow from our existing contract numbers to get there? So where you are in the contract kind of matters. So all of those things go into it. If you're at the very beginning, I would think that the direction would be to borrow from existing. I think some of these examples, they're running out of money all over the place. They haven't done very much work. You know, they're out of CM money. They're out of all these monies. So that's, you know, in our example, that's why Kaha'a is getting involved early on so that we can keep him informed and know when he's going to participate or Federal Highways will participate and when they won't. So definitely have to get that process started sooner rather than later. If it's at the end of your contract, you may have to write it up. You may have to include in your request, you know, escalation costs or whatever, but I don't think that would prevent you from settlement. It would prevent you from payment. But I think if you say, we're going to entertain this, we've estimated those costs, you know, it's going to be 6 months before you get additional funds, you know, and really shepherd that through the process to make sure you're getting that money.
So there's a comment about why we didn't just terminate the contract. I wish with that 30,000.
Wasn't the MTP just issued? So that's a complexity with this particular contract. And let me introduce the complexity. Unfortunately, the follow-on contracts, we talked about dispute and getting access. The follow-on contracts all had delay numbers as well. So there was a domino effect. Every delay in this contract was a $130,000 delay in subsequent contracts because so much work was supposed to be done here that then would be built upon in other contracts. And so it really wasn't an option to cancel the contract because then that would just mean there's merit for $130,000 delay in follow-on contracts. So it was like, how do we muddle through $30,000 a day knowing that there's merit? Again, on some of these big programs that they may have those. I think that's where it gets hard to imagine these maximum resolutions. But there was following contracts, and to be transparent, this is a heart example. And so there's a program. So right now, P3, the utility relocation contracts are moving utilities that then the P3 would follow on. So if utility contracts get delayed, the P3 gets delayed. The core system, which is the brain and trains of that operation, that gets delayed. So there are all these other contracts. So when we talk about maximum exposure and a domino effect that might occur, that's where these costs are coming from. And then every day there are consultant costs that get delayed, and every day just running the program has a cost. So it's similar with departments. I just feel like we don't always look at those costs because they're not consultant costs, they're staff costs. So I think in our example, we could pare that down, eliminate some zeros, but those costs are real and there's a way to estimate that. Very applicable to the discussion we're having today, that there are costs associated with risk. That discussion with P3 moved the risk to the contractor, and all those numbers, those procurement numbers have not been made public yet, but there was a public admission by one of the contractors that they were in the $2 billion range, which was far above the estimate of the government. And the discussion was, these are the costs that the risks are. So risk unrealized becomes profit. Risk realized has a cost. Put those into your matrix of, what you might consider and those alternatives considered in your analysis. And, for some of your examples, that might be the resolution. With Keith and some of these DOT ones, I know they've tried to say, let's suspend the contract, let's terminate the contract. We're at the very beginning, we're running into issues. But there, on the department side, there's a risk to canceling it, losing funds, opportunity costs on other projects. So Ledge is putting pressure to get these things done. So if you say we're canceling a contract, then Ledge goes crazy, telling us for 2 decades you're going to do this project, and now you just cancel it. So there are all those external factors that sometimes prevent that from occurring.
So Kai, when
yeah.
I've been in 2 mediations and 2 court cases.
Yeah.
In one of the court cases, so we both sides dug in their feet.
Yeah.
But in the middle of the court case, the judge pulls both attorneys aside and tells them, "You guys need to settle this before I make a decision, because I'm already leaning one way. And when I make a decision, there's going to be a winner, and the loser is going to lose bad. So at least if both of you guys settle, you both lose a little bit. Right. You don't lose the whole thing. Our training is recommending settlement, and when it finally gets to file a claim, and okay, we got a solid case, right? Even at the solid case, the judge actually is going to recommend settlement, and because he's a public servant too, right? It's actually a good advice. I think it's just quantifying what is the settlement and
right.
How do we write it up, which is what the course is all about. So.
And it's hard because it amazes me when both sides are so right and they feel they're so right. Like they both can't be right. But that goes back to the very beginning of what disputes are. Interpretations, lack thereof, disagreements, whether they're real or perceived, become these costs. And so it amazes me. Personally, I was involved with a court case. It was a family issue. So part of the family is like, we're right. And I'm like, okay, these people are right and these people are right. Doesn't matter because everybody's paying legal fees every single month. So the only people that are really right are the lawyers.
And then the other part was when you guys talk about opportunity cost, your investment of your time, because when you're in a court case, even mediation, when you're in mediation, it sucks your energy up totally. You cannot multitask. If you're the project engineer or if you're the lead person for the department, it consumes you because again, you're fighting to be right. And in front of an arbitrator or a mediator or a judge, you need to present the whole case and do it correctly. And so it drains you. It literally drains you, and you cannot focus on other stuff. And there's a cost to that. It's just nobody really thinks about it, but they're just trying to be right.
I think that on the personal case I dealt with, that was why I personally pushed for settlement, because I could see the emotional toll it was going to take and the distraction from other priorities in people's lives. And I was like, to me, it's not worth it. It's not fun. I think we had a dinner the other night where it was the only resolution that's really right is the one where everybody walks away upset. And if you're both upset, then it was a good resolution.
Yeah, and that's what the judge said. What our lawyer said is in the other media. So the one where the judge told us to settle, we ultimately did settle. In the other one that we lost, actually, the critique afterward was, and Alan hinted at this, I don't know about today, but she hinted at it. Some judges are predisposed to give the contractor greater leverage because the government had the more control in the plans that we put out, the contract that we wrote, monitoring the progress. But some of the judges, they're like, oh, the contractor is just a poor business person, right? And they have less information. So it's like, wait a minute.
Yeah.
They know what they were getting into. You know, I
Yeah.
mean, they signed the contract. It says liquidated damages. You do not have to prove actual, but
Right.
normally you have to prove actual. And it's like, wait a minute. But then so anyway, we lost.
I
The
mean,
judges are
there's several court decisions that show that the drafter of the document is perceived as being more responsible and therefore more liable.
And I think so in our horror story example, that weighed into the decision to settle at 1.5. Because even though staff wasn't happy about it, there was so much documentation that showed the drafter and eventually the government who put those projects out, awarded the projects, NTP'd the projects, had culpability. And so even
and
though
then
1.5 number was probably higher than we wanted to swallow, there was a recognition that the government had culpability in that issue and that we would lose in court. So it was like, let's just settle now and we can start. Part of it was start fresh, put
Right.
away all these issues. We'll identify the changes. We'll move forward. And that issue just snowballed and snowballed and snowballed because it wasn't resolved and things added onto it. I mean, it just goes back to that, that was only the tip of the iceberg of what was coming. And so if we could at least put that issue
Right.
behind us and move forward, there was value in that others on the team did not recognize. They dug in. And like I said, during mediation, found out that the direction had come from the deputy. And for whatever reason, nobody knew about it. I knew about it.
So Kai,
Nobody talked to me.
that mediation I forget how many months it lasted, but I was still at heart when they were doing it, and Sam had to lead it.
Yeah.
And the other people, not maybe Sam, but anyway, Sam was involved. When they finally figured it out at whatever, 8 million or whatever, what Sam told me is that, okay, half of it, about half, was that miscommunication. So once they figured out, okay, the contractor does have merit, okay, then we'll settle on his price. So half of the 8 million was the contractor's merit. The other half was because they just dug in their heels, both sides. So finally, it boiled down to the mediator saying, okay, both you guys, you're not going to go anywhere. You're so stuck on what you believe in, you're not going to go anywhere. So why don't you just split the difference? When I heard that, that's when it was like, are you crazy? Splitting the difference means I cannot find merit either way. Let's just cut it in half. If the project engineer at the beginning knew that the bosses were going to give away half the price or 50 cents on the dollar of whatever the contractor was asking just because they couldn't figure out a solution, because they got tired. Basically, when you split the difference, that's because you got tired. You're banging a hand against the wall, and they were both saying the same thing. They just split the difference because they got tired. Okay, so at the beginning, go back. If you knew that your bosses was going to just split the difference, would you have dug your feet in so hard? And then they said, well, who knows?
So,
that's all they said. Who knows?
Here's a better ending to that story. The particular resident engineer project manager on the project that didn't write up the $1.5 million change at the beginning happened to be part of the end and asked, why didn't we settle at 1.5 in the beginning? And it happened to be that person's responsibility to write it up, and they just never did it.
And you know
they didn't
who this
believe
person
in it.
is. Okay, later.
Because I was there. We'll talk more about the specifics, but I thought that was the ultimate irony of the whole thing. Was like,
that's karma.
Why didn't we settle? And it was, I actually have a position paper from the person that said why not to settle. And I had Alan and I looked at it. Alan put together some justifications. We made a decision at our level. We presented it to the administration at the time and said, this is why we think we're okay, XYZ, all these things. And then it was directed to settle, and staff didn't believe in it. They never did it. Then you couple that with personnel turnover, and then people lose track of the issue because it's there, but it's constantly talked about because contractor didn't turn over. They knew exactly what the issue was. They had their documentation together. So I just thought it was kind of interesting.